Well, good morning to you all, and many thanks. I think my favorite moment in that stretch of introductions was when Sarah was thanked for working with Andrew Sullivan. I think there are other people in the room who deserve thanks for enduring that challenge as well. Um, and I also would just like to say we feel so enormously fortunate to be at Grace under Robbie's leadership, so inspired by the work that Sarah and John Robert have done, so inspired by the work of too many people in this room for me to list all of them, but it's a privilege to be speaking in this particular context. There is a sort of echo of what you just heard about the choir in what I'm about to say, which is to say that if the choir can find its true meaning by singing it both in the Vatican and at a concentration camp, then I think in talking about the experience of the LGBTQ youth today, that is called both for celebration and for concern. And I want to be able to express both of those things and to express also a little bit of what it's like being a parent who is part of that community. My husband is here. Our son has graciously joined us, and he can speak to that experience in an entirely different way on 10 other occasions. So I feel that we live in a very polarized world, as all of you doubtless know, and as will be fully manifest, I think, in about 10 days, when the polling stations are all open. And part of that polarization is tended to be that there are two narratives of what LGBTQIA plus life, which I'm going to call queer life because I have to say LGBTQIA too many times during this talk. I won't be able to say anything else. But what that life is like. And they tend either to be the rhetoric of celebration, which people say it's the most glorious, wonderful, amazing thing, and talk about the progress that's been made. Or they're the sort of rhetoric of, the suffering is impossible and you should all understand that we're living lives of unspeakable difficulty. And the reality is that, as so often in a polarized society, the nuance that lies in between is what tends to get lost. And I think particularly in speaking to parents, whether their children are queer or not, it's important to emphasize that these realities are true. The wonderful stuff is really wonderful. The horrific stuff is truly horrific. And the lives that most children are leading today, most queer children, and indeed many queer parents, contain elements of both. Because most of you have been stuck in irksome traffic jams when there was a pride parade going on, or have in other ways been caught in difficult situations, I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the challenges are, but I don't want to do so without dwelling also on what some of the delights are and what some of the pleasures are, and without pausing to celebrate all of what has been accomplished. I'm 60, and when I was younger, the idea that I would be married to a man and would have children and would be speaking to the Parents Association at the school would have seemed like the most exotic, obscure, and fantastical dream. And I do want to acknowledge how thrilling it's been to be a witness to all of that progress. I'm also going to remark, with due respect to people's varying political opinions, that anyone who has actually gone through the unpleasant business, I think, of reading Plan 2025 will have noticed that among its explicit guarantees is the removal of any civil rights laws application to LGBTQIA plus populations. And we therefore are always standing, I think, at the brink of disaster, not only in terms of furthering justice for the community, but also in terms of holding on to the justice that does exist. And there was an interview recently, which actually rather struck me, with Prince William, the now Prince of Wales in England. And he was asked, how will you respond if it turns out that one of your children is gay? And he said, Catherine and I would be completely supportive of our child. He said there will be no problem within our family from any member of our family. He said, but what would happen to such a child in the public eye is terrifying to me. And Catherine and I have spent a lot of time talking about what kinds of protections we would be able to offer. And in saying that, I thought he summed up so much of what the reality is, which is that even in the instance, and most race parents, I think, fall into this general category of parents who are very supportive, the challenges that lie outside and beyond can be really quite extensive and quite overwhelming. And I think even for gay parents, there's a sort of constant sense of being on display. I had a brief period of seeing a therapist, and when I described the difficulty that one of my children was having, someone who's not actually here at Grace, she said, I mean, even the way you had children was the way her comment began. And I feel as though there is a constant pressure as a queer parent, not only to be a good parent in the way that everyone is, but somehow to prove to people that it's okay for gay people to have parents. And I think it is okay, but I think proving it on a day-to-day basis can be unbelievably draining and unbelievably wearing. I also think it has its joys and its pleasures, and that a sense of humor is one of the things that has gotten us through extremely well. And I suddenly was thinking this morning of the fact that I was at John and I were at a benefit, I think about a year ago, and we came home and we were describing it to our son and said that, I said, yes, I said, I was talking to this person who I'm afraid I had not really been aware of before. I said, he was named Ryan Reynolds. And Greg said, oh my God, if you only told Ryan, why don't you like that? I said, you hate that kind of party. You didn't want to go. And he's thinking about Ryan. I mean, he's so amazing and he's so good. He said, and he's so good looking too. And I said, I didn't actually think he was particularly good looking. And George said to me, Dad, you're not gay enough. So that was the way that we pulled through. I want to say how much this sort of battle is ongoing. I'm involved in a lot of philanthropic efforts. I'm a trustee of the New York Public Library. We had a gigantic battle, which ultimately was successful. The library has a collection of historic Pride banners, and I said, why not actually display them during Pride Week, which eventually happened, but seemed not to have crossed the mind of the people at the library. And I said, for all of the people who don't feel fully accepted, to see a major New York institution embracing the community with which they have some affiliation actually makes an enormous difference. I said, and it's a sad thing that there's so much hesitation around this. I'm also a trustee at the Metropolitan Museum. We had a conversation about wall labels a while ago because the wall labels are being redone. If the artist is of any particular ethnicity or cultural group, that's indicated on the labels. And I said, well, we never indicate whether the artists in question are part of the queer community or were part of some version of whatever it was that predated the queer community as we know it now. And the response I got was, yeah, but a lot of them probably don't want to be identified that way, as though it was still this terrible, embarrassing thing that kind of was enormously private. And I said, it's not that you're getting into the details of their erotic life. I said, but if Donatello could write to the Pope and say, the commission you've given me is going to be late because I've just broken up with my boyfriend, I'm really upset about it, and I need a few more months. And the Pope would write back and say, I hope you meet someone, and could you please get on with what I've commissioned? I thought then Donatello doesn't appear to have been keeping it a big secret. And the idea that we have now decided that it's terribly shameful is something that resonates. It resonates for me as a trustee of the museum. It resonates, I think, for many of the people who go to the museum. It resonates all over the place. And people who are queer have many experiences that other people don't have. And I won't try to categorize all of them, but I felt it was wonderfully summed up by someone I know whose mother was really struggling as he came out. And he came from a very traditional Catholic background. And he finally said to her, you know what? He said, I am liking this so much, but if I am reincarnated, I want to be gay next time. And his mother said to me when we spoke about it afterwards, she said, and I just decided if he's having that good a time, there's no point my being so miserable about it, she said. So I said to him, okay, I said, let's go to the beach. We'll see who you like. We'll see who I like. And there is a sense of affiliation and fun that can be part of this whole process. But there is the coming out experience, which it has in most instances, though certainly not in all, if not with immediate family, with the larger world, presented its enormous complications. We're all aware of things like bullying that go on, we're aware of people's discomfort often with the idea of gayness. In the same way as any other marginalized group, this brings in a kind of intimacy and closeness that can be unbelievably precious and even inspiring. I found as I traveled around the world, and I've done a lot of international reporting through my career, that I've met people I would never otherwise have found my early days romance with Soviet rock stars and Greenlandic dogs-led drivers and other people I would have been unlikely to get to know terribly well under other circumstances, and that's come as a great privilege. But I'm also aware, as time goes on, of what is happening in these various places and of the difficulties that people are encountering. So I want to talk for a minute about that. The originator of the program of LGBTQ studies at the university I attended was Larry Kramer. Some of you may be aware of him. He lived just a few blocks from here. He was a friend. He was a neighbor. He gave us lovely baby presents when our children were born. He was the founder of ACT UP and really started the whole movement of finding solutions to the AIDS crisis. I used to say that he was a grumpy, impossible person whose grumpy impossibleness fell in just the right place to save untold millions of lives. But Larry described what it was like to be gay at Yale in the 1950s. And when he talked about it, I thought, I don't know how he survived. In fact, he did make a suicide attempt while he was there. And I thought, thank goodness I was there in the 1980s. And then I sometimes lecture in that department, and so I would return and meet the younger students, and I would say to them, I would say, my great hope is that you will be as jealous of the next generation as I am jealous of you. And yet, because I felt as though the width of despair that there was around gay life at Yale, which was a fairly embracing place when I was there in the mid-1980s, had really changed. And yet, I'm struck as I look at things that, for example, the CDC, which is hardly what you would call an activist organization, just published a statistic. LGBTQ identified high school students, 26.3% have made a viable suicide attempt in the last 12 months. I don't think people realize how much struggle there still is, even if we don't have whatever rights have been won taken away. Then there was a campaign called It Gets Better, which was supposed to cheer people up by saying, you'll see, you'll end up as happy adults no matter how much you're struggling now. And it didn't do terribly well with the people at whom it was aimed, because by and large, the experience of those people was to think, A, I'm 12 and I look at people who are 42 and I can't get to that point. And B, even those people at 42 are still at the brink of tears as they talk about the experiences they had when they were my age, and the isolation that they felt, and the secrecy that they lived in. And people were, I think, distressed by the idea that that was where things were headed. I'd note, and I'm not very fond of statistics, and I won't use many of them, but more than half of homeless youth in the United States are LGBTQ youth. People are constantly being thrown out into the world. And the business of having a secret, for however long it is that you have it before you come out to your parents and to the world, that is a process that makes it very difficult to trust anyone, because you know how well you have kept your secret, or how badly in some cases, but in any event, that you've kept a secret. And the idea of other people not being full of enormous, impenetrable secrets is very difficult to overcome. I worked for a little while at the Trevor Project, which is a hotline where LGBTQ youth who are feeling depressed or suicidal can call for support. There was a call that came in, not to me, but to the person next to me, but I heard the whole conversation, where somebody said, I'm 14 and I just came out to my parents. And the person next to me said, oh, he said, well, how did that go? And he said, my father said, this is a Christian household. Your mother and I are going to leave the house now. I'm putting my gun on the kitchen table, and you know what you should do. I think that in New York, we sometimes forget for how many people that's the reality. When I was writing about life among queer Black men in Mississippi and the ways in which they form families, I met someone who has actually remained a friend and with whom I'm still in touch. He had the unlikely name of Dobronsky because his mother was watching the Olympics when he was born and named him after some athlete who had won a prize. But Dobronsky was sitting at home. He was 13 years old, and his grandfather suddenly turned to his father using an expression which is not much used, I think, in this part of the country, but is there, and said, your son is a punk. What's he doing here? And his father looked at him and said, what are you doing here? And Dobronsky left the house, and he never went home again. He was homeless for quite a while. He's had a life that's involved an incredible amount of suffering, though he's emerged into a certain level of triumph since then. I said, you live in this relatively small town in Mississippi. I said, you must have run into them since. He said, I saw them once, and it didn't go well. And that was the story of his life. And that kind of loneliness is so pervasive. When I was doing a study that involved looking at life in Utah and was interviewing people in the Mormon community, I interviewed someone who had survived a suicide attempt. He had shot himself through the neck because he said, I knew my mother would want an open casket funeral. And so even though he was doing the thing that would most devastate her in trying to kill himself, he wanted his face to be intact so that she could do that. And I said to him, how did you come to this point? Now, he was at a very large public high school in Alpine, Utah. Very large. I think there were 2,000 people a year. He said in his year, 22 people had died by suicide. And I said, I'm 60, and I don't know 22 people who died. But I said, how could you possibly have that number? And he just shrugged and he said, either they were using opioids or they were gay. And that seemed to him a perfectly natural explanation for why all of that was happening. I recently gave a lecture at Cook Children's, which is one of the largest children's hospitals in Texas. Was in Fort Worth. And when I spoke there, they had said ahead of time they wanted to know what I was going to talk about. They wanted to see my notes. I sent them some material. They said to me, after they had looked at things, I got a lovely, polite, everything you wrote is so charming. We were so delighted by it. It went on in that vein. And then they said, but trans issues are very political here. And one of the kids you're talking about is transgender. And please don't tell that story when you come down here. And I called my lecture agent and said, I'm happy to go to my lecture, or they can cancel it and they don't have to give me a kill fee, but I'm not going to edit it according to their concerns. But what I really thought was, this is not a gathering of people in some sort of a truck redneck thing. This is a children's hospital in a location where an enormous number of trans children are dying by suicide because of the anti-trans laws that have passed in Texas. And the people at the children's hospital didn't want it acknowledged. They didn't want it mentioned. And I said, gee, as you had said to me, lots of Jews die around here, but we'd rather not dwell on that. Or sort of,
Black people here and Mexicans, they're all dropping like flies. But let's talk about something else. At a hospital, it seemed inconceivable to me. And after I gave the lecture, in which I did in fact include that story, and spoke to the administrators who I thought would be angry, they explained that they were all terribly worried about all of these dying children, as doctors in a children's hospital ought to be. They were afraid, given that my lecture was being broadcast, that they would lose funding or become part of some kind of public scandal, because I had mentioned the fact that one child, who was not in Texas, by the way, had died in this way. And the thing seems remote when I talk about Utah and Texas, or at least relatively remote. But it's actually something that comes up over and over again. When my husband and I were traveling to Canada, quite a friendly place by and large, we got to the border where we were skiing at Mont Tremblant, and the person at the border said, as we arrived with our son, "Where is this child's mother?" And I said, "This child has two fathers, and we're both right here." And she said, "All children have mothers. We will not let you into Canada until I have spoken to his mother." And I said, "He has two fathers. We're both right here." I had a birth certificate that I carry around mostly because we've gone to places like Saudi Arabia where I thought I might be asked for it. But we weren't asked in Saudi Arabia. We weren't asked in Papua New Guinea. We were asked in Canada, and it turned into a scene at the border. And I think George was about 7 at the time. And it was not an enormous trauma, but that constant reminder, your family is not like other families. Your family is not like the families that people have. When we applied, because I would do nationals for a British passport, the consular office called and said, "I really don't understand the structure of your family." And he started off in that vein, and I said, "It is not in your job description to question my domestic arrangements." I said, "I am a UK national." I said, "and so my family has a right to British citizenship." But the fact that I was called, the fact that people ask us questions at hotels, the fact that when I went with the trustees of the Met to Germany and we toured Sanssouci, which was led by the famously, ostentatiously, incredibly gay Frederick the Great, Frederick II of Prussia, we were given an entire tour in which the tour guide, whose own proclivities I will not venture to guess at, kept saying things like, he said, Frederick II's marriage did not work out well. He built this palace. The Queen never visited. He used to like to sit in the library and have young men read aloud to him. He had these adjoining guest rooms because he had courtiers who would come to, and I thought, could someone just say who he was? It's all over the internet. I was just in Ireland last weekend for a wedding and went to the Oscar Wilde house. When you go to Oscar Wilde's house, we have to sit down and watch a 15-minute film. And in that 15-minute film, they talked about the scandal and the lawsuit, and they talked about the terrible things that happened. And I happen to have read Oscar Wilde's love letters, and some of them are gorgeous. And nobody ever used the word love in describing any of his relationships. They just talked about gross indecency and immorality. And these things eventually begin to wear you down. And as one gay youth I know said, it's very hard waking up every day knowing that more than half of the world hates me, even though they've never met me. And I think that's an experience which has a really strong effect, even on children who come from accepting households. But of course, those children will fare a great deal better than the children who are being thrown out. But the number of people who are being attacked is huge, and I've just initiated a process at Human Rights Watch of trying to put together better numbers than we have, because the word genocide has been being thrown around a lot in the last year, as some of you may possibly have heard. And there has been a genocide against queer people that has been going on for years. And one is constantly running into suggestions like, oh, well, you don't want to look too gay when you go through customs or you'll probably get stopped, people will say to me. And then you get to the point where you can't really tell any longer quite what's going on. a good friend of mine, someone I've known for many, many years, a beloved friend of the family, her brother was murdered recently, and she was beside herself. And when John and I had lunch with her, I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Well, he'd been at a bar," she said, "and he probably had too much to drink. And as he was leaving, he was kind of stumbling, and someone said, 'What are you, a faggot?' And he turned around and said, 'No, are you?' So the other person murdered him. And I just thought, oh, I see. If you say someone that he's someone like me, we're likely to get murdered for that in the parking lot of a bar." And what most struck me was that when she told this story, which was heartrending, I had known her brother very slightly, who, by the way, was not gay. But when she told this story, what struck me was that it hadn't occurred to her that it would be disturbing to me in a different way than it might be disturbing to other members of the general public. The language of microaggressions, I think, can get very tiresome and has been overused. But it's important to know that they exist and that these challenges are ones it is very difficult to get away from. And when I look at the question of parenting, someone said to me, "Do you think it's hard, though, to be the child of gay parents?" But there are other experts in this room. You can ask about that later on. One of them sitting in the front row. But I said, you know what? I said, there are a lot of things that are hard. It's hard to be the child of poor parents. It's hard to be the child of immigrants. It's hard to be the child of parents who don't have much intellectual ability and don't know how to negotiate day-to-day life very well. But no one has suggested that those people shouldn't have children. I have a good friend who lives in Italy. We have good friends who live in Italy and who have two delightful children. We've gone to visit them. Italy already had a law preventing gay couples from adopting children. And when I spoke with Jonathan recently, it was right after the current Prime Minister of Italy had put through a law which says that people who use surrogacy, even abroad, are breaking the law and may be put in jail. And the purpose of the law was to end the existence of families like mine. And when you read stories like that, or hear them, or talk to people who are directly affected by them, I spoke to an Italian couple now living in Boston who had been planning to have children and said they were now afraid to go forward because if they went home, they might be thrown in jail for having a family. And I thought, what does the destruction of so much potential love in the world actually accomplish? And how does the knowledge of it for children who hear these things? If you're a queer child, you hear this news. It is not a great secret. You hear the laws in Ghana. You hear all of what's happening around the world. What does it do to them to have that information? And I sometimes think that we make the mistake of thinking, because many of us, I would like to think, in this room have advanced so far, of thinking that our children don't have to live in a larger world. But that's actually not the case. Many of them have to live in that larger world, and many of them will end up, as I did, talking to someone who was a New York psychotherapist who said, well, for someone who had a miserable childhood like yours, she began, and I interrupted her and I said, we've been working together for some time. I said, I actually had a very happy childhood. There was this one central thing that I had a secret from my parents that was difficult. And she said, well, but I mean, as a gay child growing up in the 70s, I mean, you must have been miserable. And I said, no, I feel I had a very fortunate childhood, not a flawless one, but a very fortunate childhood. That presumption is just ubiquitous. I interviewed someone recently in connection with the book that I'm writing, who was an immigrant from India who had a son who had died by suicide. She had done extraordinary things to try to be supportive. She was in a community in which she had never heard of what a psychotherapist did, but she knew they were out there, and she found one. And she was very determined, and she found a gay North Indian couple in Chelsea, male couple, and took her son so that he could meet them because she wanted him to see that a happy life was possible. And after he died, when I was at her house, she made the most incredible, enormous Indian meal. And I said, Shilpa, I said, I just came to have this. You didn't have to do all of this. And she said, I wanted to make all of Shiv's favorite foods one last time. And I said to her, she said, I feel so responsible. And I said, you did everything. I said, you were so, and her husband was, and I said, you did everything you could possibly do. I said, it's a difficult world. I said, let me tell you some stories about what goes wrong. And I told her about that boy whose father had left the gun on the kitchen table. And I told her about Jablonski Jefferson being thrown out of his house. And of course, the parents who do those things are not available for interview. So I know those stories from those people. And she put her hand very gently on my arm. She lives in New Jersey. Put her hand on my arm and she said, yes. She said, but those boys are still alive, aren't they? And that was the end of that conversation. She's been an extraordinary activist for the cause, especially in her community. And one of the things that she's done is to help organize pride events. And the reason that that word pride has become so endemic to the larger queer community is because the expectation from so much of the world is of shame. And the experience of so many people, even among children at a place like Grace, is an experience of shame and loneliness and a sense of inadequacy. And so those declarations of pride, accompanied though they are by people having an absolutely fantastic time and dancing around on floats, something that, believe it or not, I was once in a position to do, those are the people who are refusing that narrative of shame. And I keep thinking of the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. Many of you may remember that it's a moment when she grabs Alice and says, run faster, as fast as you can. And when they finish running, Alice says, but what exactly were we where before we started? And the Red Queen said to her, here. She said, you have to run as fast as you can to stay where you are. If you want to get anywhere, you have to run twice as fast as that. So I'll conclude this part of the talk by saying that I was at the birthday party of a great friend, a writer, Anne Applebaum, who lives partly in England, partly in the US, and partly in Poland this summer. And I was seated next to someone, I wasn't quite sure why, but who was a noted historian and the wife of the editor of the largest newspaper in Poland. Many of you may know, or you may not, that Poland until recently had some of the most stringent anti-gay policies of any place, and that the government that enforced them, the so-called Law and Justice Party, was finally defeated, and that those laws are being reversed. And she and I had been chatting for a while, and then I mentioned that my husband and son were also there. And she said to me, I have a gay son, she said. He's the love of my life. She said, when they wanted my husband to publish things that he didn't believe in the paper, they said they were going to out him. And he said, they're not going to do that to you. And he outed himself and then moved to Belgium. And she said, I've missed him ever since. And she called her husband over, and her husband said, to those people, he wasn't a human being. He was an ideology. He said, he's such a lovely person. I hope we'll get to meet him. And then, to my surprise, this man, the editor of a large Polish newspaper, took his wife's hand in mine and said, why don't we all dance together? There was a beautiful starlit night, and we stood there and we danced, and I thought, the mix of melancholy and intimacy that inhered in that particular moment, as the three of us danced, all thinking about their son whom I had never met, it represented to me both the tremendous bond that exists among people who have shared any difficulty, in the same way, for example, that people in Ukraine right now talk about democracy much more eloquently than people here do. There was a sort of intimacy in that, and yet it had been determined by this melancholy. So when we look at all of this, and I have many more examples, and if you want to come sometime and listen to me for 4.5 hours, I'll be glad to go on. I think as a school and as a group of parents, there are two things we have to focus on. One of them is, what do we do for our kids who are queer in some way, who are LGBTQIA+ in one fashion or another? We have to support them. We have to make them feel loved. It's pretty straightforward. But the other piece of it, which is often much more complicated, is what do we do for our kids who are straight? And what do we teach them so that they actually will be able to interact with these other kids in a fashion that is respectful and even admiring? If they're learning American history and they're learning about the civil rights movement, and we're celebrating Martin Luther King Day, which I strongly believe we should be doing, then shouldn't we also at some point recognize the unbelievable courage of the people at Stonewall who in 1968 said, we will not tolerate this thing of the laws that are prejudiced against us, and a few blocks from here stood up to them and began what has become the movement that has allowed a family like mine to exist? When we're talking about people in history, should we mention, oh, and by the way, just so you know, Alexander the Great was gay. We could mention Andy Warhol and his involvement in the community. We could talk about what it was that Harvey Milk did that broke through. When we're reading authors, we could talk about the way that Whitman's sexuality played a determining role in what he wrote. I think all the time of the people, the many people whose stories are being taught without that information. It's not a question of whether Donatello's sexuality was private or Leonardo's, because they weren't, but it's a question of saying these great people who transformed humanity, Leonardo da Vinci, they were people who identified in this way. And if we have great esteem for them, how can we treat these other children so badly and not recognize the struggle they have and not know that whatever triumph there is, there's always, as there was that night in Poland, also a note of melancholy that runs through their lives and that they will probably never escape, and that their ability, their learned ability to tolerate that persistent melancholy, which I myself have, their ability to tolerate that even in a joyful celebratory life, and I know that I'm among the very lucky people in the world, how can we not recognize that and admire it and learn about it and pay tribute to it and take it seriously? At one point, I was talking to someone, a psychiatrist I had seen actually. It's New York, everyone sees psychiatrists, or at least many people do, and I did for many years. For 25 years, someone who sadly died at the beginning of COVID. And Dr. Friedman said to me at one point when I was expressing sadness about something, he said, I don't even know if it's worth being sad about this particular thing. And he said, and it was much more apt than what the other person I just quoted said, he said, your childhood was a beautiful one, but it left you with a reserve of autonomous dysphoria. He said, and you attach that sadness to different things. He said, and by writing, as I have done, about things like depression and suicide, you free yourself to have a life which is primarily characterized by joy and happiness and celebration. And those are the ways that you make it through. I met a couple of days ago with someone with whom I'm working on a film, and she said, what we hope to do, she said, it's Sheila Nevins, who used to run documentaries for HBO and really established a lot of what constitutes current documentaries. She said, don't expect to bring about a transformation. She said, nudge a few people and save a few lives, and you will have succeeded. And I said, do you think we'll count it a success? I said, if my friend were to wake up and say, it's hard to get up every day, but I know that it's less than half of the world who hate me without ever having met me. And she said, let's stop trying to sing this "the sun will come out tomorrow" song and just try to make some umbrellas. I thought that it was a very beautiful way of describing it. So perhaps if we all live to be very, very old, we'll see things inch along. I'm going to beg all of you, as you interact with your own children, to tell the ones who are fighting in the front line of this fight
that they are brave, and to tell the ones who aren't that those other children are brave, and to recognize the courage and the determination that have gone into this process, and never, ever to say that who they are is inherently lesser. There's some terrific gay people. There's some pretty dreadful gay people. And I seem to know quite a few of them. But their wonderfulness or terribleness is not in here in their sexuality. So thank you, and I'm glad to take some questions. Thank you. Thank you.